Welcome everyone to another iteration in a new semester of the joint Brown-Harvard seminar on South Asian politics. We have two sessions this semester here at Harvard. We have today's, and then I believe it's on April 4th. We have a presentation from Aditya Dasgupta. So we hope you'll join us for that as well. And there are a couple at Brown, including next week. There is one at Brown on Friday. So there are details about that online. But today we have Thibaud Marcesse, who will be presenting this paper called How Partisan Are Village Republics. Thibaud is an assistant professor of comparative and South Asian politics at Boston College. He received his PhD from Cornell University, and he broadly works on the impact of institutional change, poverty alleviation, and development with a heavy focus on India. This is a new project, I believe, so I know there'll probably be quite a bit of interest. Typically, we don't do sort of open Q&A. We typically do kind of more clarifying questions if you're okay with that. Then we'll have Gilles Vernier from Amherst giving us sort of prepared discussant comments, and then we'll open up more broadly to everyone else. So if you have clarifying questions, feel free to raise your hand. But Thibaud, it's all you for 35, 40 minutes or so.
That should work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for giving me the chance to speak. I haven't actually spoken at the joint seminar in a few years now. And as you said, so this is indeed a new project. It really is. I mean, this is the very beginning of a new project. But the data I use, and I will explain in detail how the data was assembled, how the data set was assembled. The data is a bit of a spin-off from my first project. So my first project was on NRGS, the implementation of NRGS in Uttar Pradesh. And to do the study of NRGS implementation in Uttar Pradesh, I ended up putting together a fairly large data set, which included data on Gram Panchayats, on the reservation status of Gram Panchayats specifically. And so I ended up sort of like, I wanted to make the most of this data because the coding process, I'll tell you all about the coding process, was very, very time consuming. And this was this was just before we knew that ChatGPT can actually help a lot with transcription, coding, and all these things. And so I thought maybe it would make sense to, I mean, I've been interested in political parties in party building for a very long time now. This was something I was interested in when I was in graduate school already. And so I thought this would be perhaps a way to get this new project on parties and party building at the local level in India using this data on Gram Panchayats and UP. So let me just, oops, I need to use this thing, right? Let me just start by giving you so what is really the sort of motivation of this project? I just want to also, but before I start with the broad description of the project, I want to set expectations. Some of the findings I have here are fairly preliminary, so I'm very open to I actually need your feedback. I will look forward to your feedback because there's a number of things I've been thinking about how to improve. As I said, I think I will explain to you how the data set was put together, and the data is quite sometimes complex to handle and manipulate. So the background is really local level democratization in India, and specifically the introduction of the 73rd and 74th Amendments to the Constitution of India in 1992. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I assume the audience is fairly familiar with these two amendments, but it's like I usually tell my students. I teach at Boston College, and when I tell them about the amendments, I tell them that you don't want to think about this as just some kind of procedural event, which it was because it ended up amending the Constitution, but it's really a fundamental transformation of Indian democracy. Right. And when you think of like the way democracy emerged in India, it was very much an elite project. It was a top-down project. And if you go back to the debates of the Constituent Assembly, there was a real reluctance at the time to empower local government and to allow for elections to be held at the local level, specifically at the village level.
Especially when Ambedkar.
And especially coming the pushback, most of the pushback came from Ambedkar. And there was in fact agreement at the time that elections would not, that there would be at least no constitutional mandate for elections at the local level, even though after independence, several states in India held elections relatively frequent, fairly frequently, depending on the states, obviously, there's been quite a bit of variation, but there was no constitutional mandate per se. And so you really have to wait until 1992-93 for this sort of massive expansion in the amount of power, and I paraphrase Samuel Huntington here, to happen in Indian society. So it's a very significant event. Local elections held across approximately 250,000 village councils or Gram Panchayats. And then the second sort of this is really, you want to think about this as a two-pronged event. One is obviously elections, this constitutional mandate for elections, but the second is the implementation of quotas of descriptive representation, which again, I assume you all know the ins and outs. I think this is a subject that has been very thoroughly researched in political science and economics for over the last decades, like 2-3 decades now. Why? So the interesting thing about local level democratization is that we do have a fair amount of research on why that happened, right? So talking about the timing, the scope of local level democratization, we know that the decision was made in 1992 with respect to a specific political environment. And so I mentioned here the work of Anjali Thomas-Balkan, who has done a wonderful job demonstrating what were the incentives really that party leaders and elected officials at the time at the national level had to democratize, to mandate local elections. So we have a lot of. Can you say what about? Well, the incentive, Anjali basically argues that what is critical is really the relationship between the party and government and the party organization itself. And that essentially elected officials, the party and government essentially, so people who represent the party and government, decide to democratize when they lose control of the party organization, right? So in a way, it's a way to undercut a party organization that might be, and I'm simplifying an argument, but I think this is really the gist of it. Elected officials who represent the party and government decide to democratize because they see this as a way to create another channel of accountability, another way for them to mobilize votes at the local level that would essentially bypass the party organization, right? And so what is actually very powerful is that she makes the argument for local level democratization at the national level, but also at the state level in India. Because local level democratization that came out of the constitutional amendments was also left to the states to implement, since constitutionally, the states are responsible for local government. So this is a very, very powerful account in the sense that it accounts for decisions made by the national government of India in 1991-92, but also by the states when they were faced with this constitutional mandate to expand democratic participation at the local level and empower local government as well. Because local level democratization was also about sort of occasionally giving responsibilities to local panchayats, Gram Panchayats, and other institutions of the Panchayati Raj to implement policies, collect taxes in some states, etc.
The idea is that the state level party organizations are sort of shifting away from the national party level organizations?
No, it's always with Anjali really emphasizes the tension that arises at any level of governance, right, between the party and government, the elected officials who represent a party, and the party organization. So she says, for instance, the reason why we don't see local level democratization in the 70s and 80s in India is because Indira Gandhi has a real grip. She really controls the party organization in a way that doesn't require her to bypass the party organization, if you wish.
So the one I'm trying to understand is like, what is the party organization doing for what's the relationship between the party organization
and the party and government? Well, the party organization is really what theoretically supports the party and government, right? Mobilizes votes, pushes for specific legislation, et cetera, et cetera.
But from the beginning also, there was an impetus from party leadership to create this sort of new layer of governance to also bypass intermediaries that were bogging down, the development project. So,
okay.
I know that's the explanation, but I'm not wholly persuaded. I think one could argue it was an exogenous ideological move. But anyway, that's not the main issue.
But it's a very, I mean, it's
not the main issue.
It's an argument that is very much about It's not about a social movement. It's not about, it really is about the decisions made by politicians, which is really interesting. And so why do I mention this is because this is, I think, a very good account of theoretical and empirical account of why local level democratization happened and how it reflected the decisions, partisan decisions essentially, right? The decisions made by party leaders in 1991 and 92. But what we don't know as much is how parties that were not privy to those decisions, that did not take part in those decisions, have adapted to this new institutional environment, because it is a very significant, it's a momentous development, and one that has fundamentally sort of like reshaped local democracy, right? So the question is, how do parties really adapt, knowing that now they have, you know, if you think of party building in the first decades after independence, you have party elites trying to couple together coalitions, relying in the early days on local brokers. With this mandate, constitutional mandate for local elections, you have a fundamentally different landscape, right? In which now you have elections, and you have on top of that the implementation of quotas that really sort of like shift the political ground every 5 years or so, every electoral cycle. So that's really the motivation of the project, right? And so some of the broader questions, and I've already kind of hinted at that, is, you know, how do political parties mobilize voters in rural India today? How do parties really leverage local elections? And so here, by the way, the presentation really focuses on the Gram Panchayat, but this is not obviously just about the Gram Panchayat. As you know, the Panchayati Raj institution has 3 tiers, right? So the Gram Panchayat, the block Panchayat, and the district Panchayats. I'm not really looking at the upper levels, the block and the district. That is in fact part of the broader project, but I'm only presenting data and a very preliminary analysis based on the data I have for Gram Panchayats. And so obviously the broader question here is, why does this matter, right? But well, how do institutions shape party building incentives in a large post-colonial democracy, in a very large very large democracy as India? So some thoughts, because before I discuss the sort of like broader, the existing scholarship and the sort of like theoretical argument I'm trying to make, some thoughts based on my own experience doing research during the 2015 Panchayati Raj elections in Uttar Pradesh. So I was doing field work in 2015 for the NRGS project, but towards the very end of my year in UP was organizing its Panchayati Raj elections, and I organized a round of interviews with both Gram Pradhans, so sitting Gram Pradhans and candidates to the local elections, to just get a sense of what the political dynamic was at the local level and how that might in fact impact policy implementation, and specifically the implementation of NRGS. So I'm using here some of those. I'm going to refer, there's one quote that I borrow from, so this is obviously a little bit dated. This is from 2015, but I think there are some insights that are probably still very relevant today, and that might help us put all the findings I'm going to present later in perspective. So one of the interesting things is that those elections are, as others have showed, very competitive, even in reserved seats, although as one might expect, political competition being restricted by law, there are fewer candidates in reserved seats, so either reserved for the scheduled caste, members of the scheduled caste, or members of the other backward classes. What I observed also that I thought was very telling was this enduring resilience of traditional social hierarchies, right? So a combination of caste-based or status-based inequality and income-based inequality, which fairly neatly overlap in rural Uttar Pradesh, right? And so that also means that occasionally the competition was done by proxy, right? So, and I mentioned here the use of different words. I couldn't actually, I don't know if the transcription from Hindi is correct, but the differences between Larana and Larna, right? So I often heard from people in the villages I visited that, you know, well, here, this is very much about 2 or 3 families fighting for elections and sort of like using proxy candidates when they have to. They don't always have to. When our seat is not reserved, they can fight directly. They can run for office directly. But when the seat is reserved, they find ways, right, to sort of bypass the reservations, and they use proxies. I mean, I remember going to a village where a village reserved for women members of the scheduled castes, where two Thakur families were effectively competing and using two women from the scheduled caste as their proxy candidates, right? So there was a form of competition, but this was not really the type of competition you might expect from the implementation of the quotas. Yes, Ashok.
So can you just remind us, because these things differ state by state, can you just remind us how exactly the quota system has been designed in UP? OBC, gender,
Yeah, so
SC.
that's a good point.
If you can just give us the building blocks of
Yes.
that. I actually forget. I mean, I knew this, so I forget because of late I've been paying attention to Karnataka, where it's not the same.
Yeah.
Each state has a different ballgame.
Yeah, in UP, so UP follows the model that other states follow, except for two things. UP has reservations for members of the other backward classes, which not all Indian states have. And that's significant. I think also on top of the 20-ish% of seats reserved for members of the scheduled caste, you have to add another 27%, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, 27% reserved for members of the other backward classes, which means that at any given time, more than 50% of all seats are indeed reserved, right?
More than 50 meaning then you add women to it, right?
And adding women to it.
And that's a
right?
separate.
Because women overlap. So women.
That has to overlap. Right?
It overlaps to some extent. You do have, so the quota for women in UP is distinct from a quota for women members of the scheduled caste and women members of the other backward classes. So, but the sort of like standard women reservation status is usually perceived as a sort of like, as being sort of more favorable to the high caste because it is just a matter of gender and not
and it's
caste
1/3.
status.
It's not. It's 1/3.
I think it's 1/3 as well for women. Yeah, yeah.
Bihar is half.
So that's very significant, and it's what was I going to say?
So it's 22%, 27%, and 33%.
No, because the women, so it's the women overlap. So the 30%. So the 30%.
It cannot be more than 50% reservation, right? Yes or no?
I think it can.
It can be.
No. It's it cannot be more than 50%, but within a particular category of reservation.
Yes.
So caste base cannot be more than 50%.
Yeah.
But you cannot add gender plus caste and see whether you reach 50%.
You can do that, and that could become 62%, 65% possible.
Yes, except that there is some overlap.
So like the women, when you say 30% of seats are reserved for women, that includes the fraction of women seats, women SC and women OBC seats is what I was
So
trying to
are
say.
you able to tell for in a given year, say 2015, which percentage of villages are reserved one way or another?
Yes, I have. I mean, I have the data. I don't have this slide. I don't have it on the slide here, but I have the data. I have. I'll explain to you later how I ended up putting the data together. So that's how it's done. The other thing about UP is, and I know we talked about this when Varun came to present his work in the fall. As far as I know, the assignment of reservations in UP is not done at random. So, and I don't think it can be assumed to be done at random for two reasons. I think a lot of the assignment is usually done based on what they call a rapid survey. So the State Election Commission is tasked with basically assessing population growth across the state at the village level. They do a sample essentially, and they make decisions on the reservation status based on that assessment of population changes, right? There's an element of redistricting as well. That happens. Unfortunately, I don't have, I've been looking for this data for quite a while. I don't have the data on this. I mean, other than like actually looking at new villages that emerge, because you see it from the names, I don't have data on the actual delimitation and the sort of like changes in like village boundaries. That's a little tricky, but that happens.
But on the whole, my point was this, on the whole, caste would not exceed 50, right? SCs and OBCs together would not exceed 50. And then even though women overlap, but some won't, some would be upper caste women, right?
Yes.
So, and therefore, if we include the overlap, then SC plus OBC plus women can easily be 65% or 62%.
But I think this
That-
goes back to the point that Gilles was making.
Yeah, but no, because the overlap is
It's-
enough that it ensures that it's under 15 in the case.
Like you,
The overlapping has to be,
But I don't think that that's mandated, but I think it's just what happens. Because there's also an incentive from the part, from, to make those,
make the
Quota
OBC and SC category more women oriented.
yeah,
You use up your women's space for that.
that's right.
And then you're left with maybe instead of 33%, you're left with 10.
but because it's, it's not random component of this, is that like oftentimes if it's reserved in one session, then they'll switch over the reservation next session. So if you look over time, there probably is quite a bit of rotation in one area
Yeah.
through the female reservation.
Yes.
But it's not, but it could have been the case that in 2015, like many of the seats that got reserved for women happened to be OBC and SC instead
Yes,
of general.
yes,
But
yes, yes.
as
But
a,
over time, because it's not necessarily, they're not doing it randomly is the sense I get. It's
Yes.
kind of informally a rotation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But there's not, it's not written down.
And there is an element of, so there's room for discretion from what I
So-
understand.
which means
So you're
negotiation.
saying that
Negotiations, yeah.
it may not cross 50%, all three together.
Pulumi?
Yes, I had a clarificatory question. So within the 1/3 for women, is it subdivided by SC, ST?
No.
and OBC? So so where does the random, how is it decided? Like, what does the overlap really mean?
Well, the overlap means that the state makes sure that the women reservation applies to the caste groups as well, to the broader caste groups as well, which is why I can show you the files. Actually, well, I'll show you the files. No, and
The 27% within the woman.
No, it's partly informal, actually.
yeah,
Informal in the sense that it can be whatever they want.
Pretty much. It's a negotiation.
it's a
process.
negotiation process. I mean, the state election has a lot of authority, can exercise a lot of discretion. My understanding is that, which is the reason why I say clearly that this is not done at random, is that I think even the district magistrates have some discretion in sort of like informing the state election commission that this seat might be, should probably be not reserved during the next electoral cycle, et cetera, et cetera. There's an element, I mean, this is what I got from like informal conversations. I don't have any.
So in other words, we are saying that OBC will be about 27%, SC will be 22%.
Yes.
And women would be 33%, and how exactly women are distributed over SC, ST?
Yeah,
SC, OBC, we don't know.
We don't know.
But this is not going to cross easily 40%, 50%.
No,
No.
that's right.
That's right.
correct.
That seems to be the inference that I'm getting, right?
Yes, that's
It's
right.
not likely to cross
Yeah.
50% reservation.
You're
But like,
correct.
Pulomi, your question was about what is the share within the woman quota for those caste groups? No,
That's-
No.
There doesn't seem to be. a
But
budget.
what's striking is that people know in advance too.
Yeah.
Right? They know that, okay, this time this is reserved, next time it's not going. So it's not something negotiated at the last moment. There's some element of planification to
Okay.
it.
Mm,
Meaning it's like set in time X and then in X plus 4 you basically know the resolution that is possible rotation.
It's not strictly done on rotation.
It's not done on rotation. No.
Strictly.
Should we
So
move
this
on?
is all discretionary.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
let's go
Maybe
ahead.
we should move
We
on.
could go back.
Let's return to it.
It's
Who is very happy that happy getting, showing
No, I just wanted to show two things. So again, going back to this sort of kind of anecdotal evidence from 2015, from those elections I witnessed, there was a lot of talk among the people I met about this, and I've been personally very interested in the sort of nature and scope of the relationship between Pradhans, Gram Pradhans, known as Mukhia and Sarpanch in other states, and the MLA, who I take to be the main sort of party agent at the local level. And so when I was there, when I was doing those interviews 10 years ago, I heard that a lot, that there was some kind of quid pro quo in the sense that, ahead of a local election, the MLA can really sort of give some kind of help if needed. I mean, elections are very costly, by the way, even at the local level, at the village level, one would not think, but they are actually very, very expensive, in large part because there's a lot of attempts to buy votes happening. done through the organization of parties. There was a distribution of local alcohol, like local liquor, et cetera, when it's not cash. So these elections are very expensive, and they can be very expensive for candidates who don't have obviously a lot of resources. So the MLA here can be seen as occasionally as someone who might be able to provide some assistance. And so here I mentioned quid pro quo because what I heard occasionally is that the expectation was that when the time of a state election would come, the Pradhan would be expected to pitch in and really do some kind of voter mobilization. All of this was very anecdotal, I want to say, right? And this was in the fall of 2015, a year and a half before the state elections of March 2017. I was actually not there. I mean, I was in UP in 2017, but I wasn't at the village level during the campaign because I arrived after the election had begun. So I was not really in a position to effectively check that this was indeed the case. From the perspective of those party agents, I'm picturing here, I'm putting the picture here of an MLA from Bahraich where I was doing my work, Yasser Shah, who was at the time also a state minister from the Samajwadi Party. From the perspective of the MLA, things looked a bit different though. From my conversations with them and conversations with others in the district headquarters, people who had knowledge of those elections and the relationship between the Pradhan and the MLA, there was no direct involvement in elections, right? So you would have never seen Yasser Shah go to an election rally in any village. And there was some kind of, I say, cautious interest here in the sense that I think the MLAs wanted to know who would be, who would effectively be in a position to win. But my understanding is that the MLAs were also well aware that, I mean, if you think of the size of a constituency assembly, an assembly constituency, I'm sorry, the sheer number of local elected officials per assembly constituency, Vidhan Sabha constituency, from the perspective of the MLA, there's a lot of information asymmetries. There's a lot of things that the MLA is not really in a position to know or anticipate, right? And I'll come back to this because I think this is a key element here of the relationship between the Pradhans and the MLA. Now, what am I testing here? What am I arguing today? Well, I'm trying to argue that the reservation system, as it is implemented, the assignment of quotas of descriptive representation, provides to some extent information clues, right? Provides some form of brand that could be seen perhaps as shaping electoral outcomes above the Gram Panchayat. The way I argue that this might be the case is that I look at essentially the new incentives for party building that local level democratization creates. I distinguish those incentives as they are for Gram Pradhans, so essentially local elected officials, and the incentives that MLAs have to reach out to local elected officials. And then I explain how I use caste as a potential vehicle to shape partisan mobilization at the local level. And I want to emphasize something here. I'm doing, this is really the first step of that project. And so I have some ideas about how caste may or may not matter, right? Based on a lot of my work before. In a way, this is a way for me to say, well, I'm starting with what everyone assumes to see whether there is any kind of validity, if there's any kind of a truth in using caste as a potential sort of marker that would explain patterns of partisan mobilization within assembly constituencies. I'm really looking at assembly constituencies here. I'm not looking at national constituencies for practical reasons, and I'll come back to this.
Can you once again tell us,
Yep.
I think you did say something about the term you're using here, party agent means
The MLA.
the MLA, right?
And this is the argument you want to make.
This is what I'm arguing in this presentation, that caste can be seen as a vehicle for political mobilization. And this is what I'm really trying to test with the data. I'll come back
Partisan
to
mobilization.
partisan mobilization. That's right.
Party-based.
Party-based.
That's
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. My dependent variable is actually the vote share of parties at the.
So the correlation between caste and party.
Yeah, caste
and
as it
party
is.
Would be very high.
Caste as it is inferred from the assignment of a quota, right? And I'll come back to this because this is a little tricky, especially
But caste at the local level.
at the local level. That is
That's
correct.
very important.
That is correct. Yes. So the building blocks of my theory. Well, one is that brokerage remains probably very, very important at the local level in rural India, based on what I observed, and based also on what we know, where there's plenty of evidence to suggest that parties continue to rely on local brokers to mobilize support ahead of an election, even against the sort of like changing party systems across India, and perhaps the rise of the BJP as a party that is more organized at the grassroots and that relies on partners at the grassroots that might be in a position to mobilize votes on its behalf. Even with this development, which is very significant in its own right, I anticipate that brokerage will continue to be an important aspect of voter mobilization ahead of state level elections. I mentioned here work from other contexts, the Brusco, Nazareno, and Stokes book on brokers from 2013. This is a lot of this Edwin Camp's work is from Latin America, but there's also work in the Indian context, of course. I forgot to mention here Tariq Tatchell's and Adam Auerbach's work on brokerage in urban settings, in slums. What is also interesting here is that brokerage does not need to overlap with partisan identity, right? Knowing that, and I will mention this again in the case of local elections, and this is something I forgot to mention when I was telling you about the specifics of the assignment of quotas. Local elections are officially non-partisan in UP, which means that candidates are given election symbols, but they're not allowed to align themselves officially, openly with political parties. So if you look at the election posters, you will see the symbols, but you will never see a partisan sign, right? So there is this idea, and this has come up in a lot of recent work on distributive politics in the Indian context, that somehow at the local level partisan identity is known, is common knowledge. I am very agnostic here. I don't know that this is necessarily the case. And I think there's something to be said about how partisanship, I think there's a tendency for people who do research on partisanship in the Indian context to see partisanship as a monolith, right? But I do think that in a multi-tiered democracy, multi-level democracy like India, partisanship is going to be itself probably very multi-layered, and it will take different forms, right? So for very obvious reasons, right? What matters during a local election, let's say for a local election, people are going to be concerned with road repairs, the clearing of irrigation canals, the building of a new community center, et cetera, et cetera. These are fairly sort of like, they're not apolitical issues, right? But they're not necessarily sort of associated, they're not easily associated with a partisan agenda or an ideological agenda. So the type of partisanship that you're going to see within the village community is probably going to be fairly different from the type of partisanship that manifests itself at the state and even at the national level. Question, yes.
So I'm trying to imagine I'm the person running for office at the local level.
Yeah.
And even though I have support from party A, let's call it BJP, or it's MLAs, it's supporting me, and I may have some inclinations towards it, proclivities towards it. I cannot use the lotus on them. That's the point.
No.
I can use whatever, I can use my face, I can use my glasses or whatever, but I cannot use the lotus.
I mean, you can get like,
you can't use your glasses.
Yeah, and the Congress inclined people cannot use the Congress.
No.
This cannot be used.
Cannot be used. So the election symbols sidestep that, and you get like, I mean, I've seen election symbols, like I've seen like pistols being used as election symbols, all kinds of weird, objects of everyday life. I guess a pistol is an object of everyday life in rural India. But no, you cannot use election symbols. And in fact, I was coming to this I was reading when I was researching why that is indeed the case. It's not very clear to me. I think there seems to be some sort of consensus on the absence of partisan labels at the local level. I actually came across a statement made by the president of India, Draupadi Murmu, in 2023. She was invited to speak at a forum on local democracy, and she made a very strong statement against allowing partisan labels at the local level in the name of social harmony, quote unquote. Which I thought was very interesting. I don't know whether this is a reflection of a BJP party, like sort of approach to local democracy, but I know that in 2015, the SP government floated the idea of allowing party symbols at the local level. That was not agreed. They decided against it. To me it is very interesting to me why that is the case. But there seems to be some kind of cross-partisan consensus on not allowing.
And
Some states do.
This differs from state to state.
It differs from state to state. But I think in India, I think only a handful of states, only two.
West Bengal and Kerala.
Yeah.
Only two allow party.
Yeah.
Like you have the party label, like party on the
Yeah.
ballot, for example.
Yeah.
West Bengal, Kerala only.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Unless
Yeah.
that's strange.
So just to clear this, like, so the point here is that brokers will continue to play an active role, and that
They're not necessarily partisan
and that
actors.
all and cultural are like wrong with costs, like still matters because of these brokers.
What, say that again, sorry.
And you're arguing that ethnicity caste is still important at this local level because this brokerage function is played by.
Caste as a vehicle of like the second building block here that I'm sort of using for my theory is that caste remains to some extent a driver of party building at the local level. This is something that again has been very extensively researched for a very, very long time. What I think I'm going to emphasize here is that more recent work, I mentioned here all the work on the silent revolution, the rise of ethnic-based parties in the 1990s, 80s, and 1990s, but more recent work suggests that the relationship between caste and partisan labels and the way they reflect, the way caste reflects a form of partisan alignment is perhaps less stable than we think. So I mentioned here Tariq's work, but also in the context of UP, a really, really fascinating book written by a journalist, not a political scientist, but a journalist, a political journalist, Prashant Jha, who wrote a book on the BJP election machine in UP, and has very, very good stories about how the BJP has essentially been reaching out to selected jatis within the SC, the broader SC category, with a view to put together a much more inclusive coalition from the BJP's perspective, and one that is not quite what we generally think that, you know, SC voters will, and based on work that has been done on the emergence of the BSP and the sort of like the silent revolution going back to the 1970s and 80s, we assume that SC voters will naturally align with the BSP. We know now that it's not the case, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But what is also interesting is to see that even parties like the BJP who claim to move beyond caste, right, continue to rely very closely on caste. Another example in 2017, in fact, when the election results were announced, a few days after the election results were announced in March of 2017. So the name of, we didn't have a candidate for chief, UP didn't have, the BJP didn't have a name for the position of chief minister. And so there was a period of about a week during which different names were floated. And in the end, so Adityanath was selected, but he was selected along two deputies who each reflected very large caste groups that were assumed to have supported the BJP in significant numbers during that campaign. I forgot the first one was I forgot his name, I'm blanking his name.
One would be a Brahmin.
Brahmin, and the other one was
Yeah.
Keshav Prasad Maurya.
Yeah.
Maurya, right.
And he himself is Thakur, so
Yeah, and Adityanath being a Thakur. Yeah, so that's the interesting thing here, which again is kind of like throwing a wrench into this idea that caste would neatly predict partisan behavior at the state level, let alone at the national level, obviously. So what am I thinking in terms of how local level democratization interacts in a way with caste? Well, the caste is a vehicle for partisanship, partisan identity to some extent. Local level democratization
Precisely what you mean by caste is a vehicle for
is a marker of
meaning that
as a predictor.
so a Brahmin is more likely to support the
Right, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm trying to test. Yeah.
Actually, using the word vehicle has two meanings. One is about partisan alignment between certain castes, but it's also the idea that you use caste as a way to mediate, to mitigate for the fact that you just cannot address yourself to each and every one. So you use intermediary social institutions as a proxy to basically address yourself to a much larger audience.
So what I'm trying to, before I test, this relevance of caste for partisan behavior at the state level, I'm trying to sort of make sense of the incentives that the local elected officials would have to effectively work for higher level politicians, and vice versa, what incentives state level elected officials would have to reach out to local elected officials. There's a way to look at this by sort of distinguishing what I call supply side incentives from demand side incentives. The paper effectively really focuses on demand side incentives, but I wanted to explain how I anticipated that actually party agents, or like the MLA at the state level, might be interested in sort of reaching out to those local elected officials. One is obviously the local level democratization creates new channels of accountability, and parties may find those channels attractive to some extent, right? This is actually what Anjali Thomas-Balkin explains in her book, that local elections can be seen as a form of signaling, right, to political parties, who is effectively popular at the local level, who is effectively competitive at the local level. So to some extent, that could be seen as a way for parties to bridge the information gap, to sort of solve those information asymmetries that I was mentioning before. The problem is that this might be very context dependent, and what I mean here is that that would depend to some extent on the nature of party organizations, and specifically their level of institutionalization, right? So in India, I think in UP specifically, so I'm going to speak perhaps more specifically about UP here, but in UP, it's probably less likely that parties will have the operation on the ground to effectively formalize ties with local elected officials, strengthen those ties, and maybe build them over time and turn them into institutional ties to local communities. From the perspective of local elected officials, you can see elections as creating opportunities for leadership, especially as the quotas are being implemented. The quotas do create, on paper, the quotas create opportunities for members of traditionally underrepresented groups to run for office, win election, and sort of like build the type of skills that politicians require to run at higher levels of government, right? And so from the perspective of local elected officials, you could think of local level democratization as, and specifically parties as a way to amplify their leadership at the local level, right? With the importance of development funds, probably more likely through bureaucratic mediation, or the distribution of patronage resources without bureaucratic mediation, right? The issue from the perspective of those local elected officials, the Gram Pradhans in this context, in this example, is that now they are really truly accountable to voters and not to parties, not exclusively to parties. You can think of brokers, I mean, most models of brokerage politics that see the sort of interaction between party elites and brokers really see the main accountability nexus as being between party elites and brokers. Here it is a little bit more complicated in the sense that those brokers who might be running for office now that elections have been mandated at the local level are also accountable to voters, right? And like voters might very legitimately hold them accountable and expect them not to, engage in a sort of more transactional relationship with members of the party elite. So here, to explain what I mean by caste as a vehicle, as a predictor of partisan identity, partisan behavior at the state level, I use caste identity here as it is conveyed by the reservation status, right? And so the issue here is that, as you know, the information on, I mean, the distribution of assignments, quota assignments is based on fairly broad categories, right? Even in the case of the scheduled castes, which we would believe to be more sort of like homogeneous, the scheduled castes include a lot of jatis that are different, that have, I mean, so from a socioeconomic perspective, I think this is a more homogeneous group than the OBC group, of course. But you still have a lot of very different jatis. The scheduled caste sort of category probably reflects more of a larger group that is not going to give us a clear, I mean, it's going to give us a sense of what the broader inclination of the SCs might be, but it's not going to tell us exactly what the individual jatis really, how they behave electorally or might be behaving electorally. The other thing is, this is more of a problem, even more of a problem for the OBC group, because the OBC group is not homogeneous from like a socioeconomic perspective. It includes, as we know, the relatively well-off, better off at least, Yadovs, and includes groups that are fairly close from a socioeconomic perspective to the scheduled caste, right? Not to mention the socioeconomic sort of like variation, heterogeneity within the scheduled caste group, which is smaller in rural India, as we know. So I'm really using this as a proxy, and it's like a very broad way of testing whether caste identity can be seen as shaping electoral outcomes at the state level. I'm well aware those categories are very sort of, they're not very fine-grained. They don't really give us a sense necessarily of how caste, understood as jati, predicts electoral behavior. One thing I want to emphasize as well, I'm really interested in those local elected officials as they interact with members of the party elite, right? So I do not take what the identity of those local elected officials as a predictor of the electoral behavior of the people living in that community, right? What we call generally the ecological inference fallacy, right? So it's not because Gram Pradhan is a member of scheduled caste and perhaps is inclined himself to mobilize votes for the BSP, just to take a hypothetical example, that the entire community behind the Gram Pradhan will behave that way. Of course not, right? And we know that even in villages that are reserved, oftentimes, the groups that benefit from the quotas only represent a plurality, if not a minority, within those village communities, right? So I'm not really interested, and I know there was a presentation 2 weeks ago at Brown on really electoral behavior within the village community, as I understand, the Pradeep Chiber, Francesca Jansenia's presentation. I'm not interested in this. I'm really looking at the behavior of those. I'm really sort of like zooming in on those local elected officials as potential brokers, right? I don't. So my argument assumes that somehow they might be in a position to move votes within the village community, to sway votes, to sway voters within the village community through, I presume, party work. All of this, by the way, is very quantitative. I don't have the sort of like qualitative insights that would be required to get a fuller picture of the relationship between brokers, so local elected officials who are brokers and members of the party elites. I'm really sort of trying to see whether the numbers tell us something, the numbers being obviously the variation in vote share. Yes.
I know we interrupted you a lot, but I'm
Oh, we're
just
running
gonna
out of
put
time.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just see if I can. Oh, so a few empirical predictions, and then I'll talk about the data fairly quickly. Knowing that local elections are officially non-partisan, I would expect the BJP to draw more support from unreserved GPs, i.e., I would expect elected officials in non-reserved seats to be perhaps more likely than others to do the swaying work in favor of the BJP. Conversely, I would expect, I would expect the SP to draw more support from GPs reserved for the OBCs. And likewise, I would expect the BSP to draw more support from GPs reserved for the scheduled caste. Again, this is the null hypothesis, right? I'm very well aware that the reality at the local level is likely to be, much more nuanced, right? But I'm trying to get a sense from the numbers whether that is indeed something we can expect.
Will be looking at vote shares in the state election.
Yes, I'm coming to, vote share at the state election, constituency level, right? So the data.
The Gram Panchayat level or
the constituency level. So I don't have the booth, I'm going to come to this. I don't have the booth level data. So I'm using basically the reservations, changes in the reservation status as my independent variable, right? And my dependent variable is the change in vote share at the constituency level, right? So I'll come back to because this is the implication here.
Assembly
constituency, assembly constituency. Vote share. I don't look at party ID because in the first past the post system, the party ID only tells you so much. A party might win an election with, I don't know, 25% of the votes, and the runner-up is at 24.1%, right? So it's not, party ID, I think here is not very, very useful. Party vote share, I think, is much more interesting. So I use, the baseline for the data set is this wonderful data set that was shared with me many years ago now by Gilles when he was at the Trivedi Center for Political Data. I didn't have data on the constituency delimitation, and so this is the data that Gilles gave me. But that data basically matched political constituencies at the national and state level with revenue villages, census villages, right? Which are not political units, right? So I did this many years ago as I was working on NRGS, because NRGS collects data at the Gram Panchayat level, not at the revenue village level. So I had to find a way to connect all those data points, right? And so what I did in this case was to connect this big Trivedi Center for Political Data data set with the political constituencies, right? With the local government directory. As it happens, the government of India has made publicly available a directory that matches revenue villages to individual Gram Panchayats, so political villages. I did this through fuzzy matching, right? Which means that there is a level of attrition, right? So the data I'm using for this project is a sample, really. I have approximately 25,000 Gram Panchayats, but there are in fact probably around 58,000 Gram Panchayats in the state of Uttar Pradesh. So I don't have the entire data for all Gram Panchayats in UP. Why? The reason is actually quite simple. I could have tried to do the manual matching, but I think I would still be working through it as of today, because it's an insane amount of work. It's incredibly time consuming. So what I ended up doing was doing fuzzy matching through statistical software. Fuzzy matching means that it's not perfect, right? The fuzzy matching gives you a matching score, right? So I then, once I did this with my software, I manually cured those matches, right? So I dropped essentially all the non-perfect matches. I kept only the matches that had a score of 1, which is the perfect score for the fuzzy matching process. I eliminated, hence the attrition rate. I eliminated the ones that were not properly matched for various reasons. And then I looked at those matched Gram Panchayats with their revenue villages and cured them manually. So if there were very obvious discrepancies, I removed them. I didn't count them, right? Knowing that, it sounds like it's a very easy task to do, but it's not, because the spelling is not uniform. So the government of India uses sometimes spelling that is different. For like, to take the example of the local government directory, the local government directory uses a spelling for Gram Panchayats that NRGS, i.e. the Ministry of Rural Development, may not use. So, and sometimes it's a very small thing, like Rampur will be 2 words in one data set, and then the other data set will have it in 1 word. So that was actually very, very time consuming. I then matched data from the State Election Commission for the reservation status. That was done. So I extracted the data from the State Election Commission website. I transcribed it. I worked with a data scientist to sort of do OCR initially, so I could take all the people. Everything is in PDF. It's available online. All of it is actually available, publicly available online. But it's not a format that lends itself easily to the type of analysis I was going to do. So I had to transcribe everything, code everything manually. And so the code is the following: 0 for non-reserve, 1 for women, 2 for SC, 3 for OBC, 4 for women in SC, and 5 for women OBC. This reflects the code used by the Election Commission of Uttar Pradesh, right? Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, I added, of course, data on, so I was able to connect the Trivedi Center dataset with the data on Gram Panchayats. And so I have connected essentially the Gram Panchayats with the data at the constituency level that I have on vote share, turnout, whether a state level constituency was reserved, because some of them are indeed reserved. So I have a pretty comprehensive, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to show you the intricacies of the data set. What I do is that I test this hypothesis of caste as a vehicle for partisan mobilization in 2 ways, very similar ways, but they're not quite looking at the same thing. I focus on the state elections, and I'm trying to see how the reservation status of a GP potentially changes the individual vote share of parties at the state constituency level. So I use a mixed model. So what I'm essentially doing is that I'm doing, this is a fairly simple multivariate model, but I'm trying to account for the individual specificity of each of those constituencies, right? So this is why I use a mixed model. So effectively, I'm looking at those changes at the constituency level, at the aggregate level, right? So I'm not using, so this is why I mentioned here limitations. I am not using data at the booth level, which I understand overlaps, I think, with GPs from what you were telling me earlier.
So the reservation status is at the Gram Panchayat.
At the Gram Panchayat, sorry.
And then why don't you just have a fixed effect and just look at the within
constituencies? Yeah. So I'm not really, so that's the limitation here. I'm actually really hoping I can get a hold of those booth level data, because that would really provide even more fine-grained, allow for a more fine-grained analysis. The other thing that I find very difficult here to model is that obviously I'm looking at the partisan vote share, but the partisan vote share is the product of many things, including the general sort of like political environment, but obviously the very sort of characteristics of the candidates themselves, right? And I say this because in UP at least, but I think it's the case in other North Indian states, parties really try to identify candidates who they know will be in a position to run a campaign effectively, i.e. will have the money to do so. And so as a result, the candidates are likely to sort of like self-select. There's an element here that I can't quite control as part of this analysis. Yes?
So your DV's constituency and one constituency could have many GPs. So how?
Yes.
Could you talk about how you're constructing your IV? So is it the percentage of seats which are reserved in the?
No, it's so I code for that model. I only look at a change. I basically use the IV as a factor variable, as a categorical variable, right? And I look at changes in vote share depending on a change of reservation set. It's a very static way of looking at this, essentially.
But how is
change in vote share based on? Sorry,
so the IV is on the independent variable side, I have the reservation status of GPs, right, at the Gram Panchayat level, as coded in 2015, right? So I'm using data for Gram Panchayats in 2015. And my dependent variable of interest is the vote share for individual parties
In the constituency.
at the constituency level. That's right.
Assembly constituency.
Assembly constituency
So
level.
then the IV would have some proportion of.
Technically,
constituencies
it
if
should be
the-
the booth level vote share. But I don't have it.
No, mean, so
I don't think
let's say
it's easy to get something.
Let's say
You
there's
get
20,
booth levels.
So that's what
Again,
Francesca and Pradeep have done.
So
if there's 20% of seats reserved in a constituency, and they flip around and reserve some other 20% of seats in the next election.
Yeah.
You still have 20% of reserved seats, right? So.
Yeah.
That's why I'm wondering, how is the IV constructed?
is it a fraction of reserve?
No, it's the identity of no, it's the status of the Gram Panchayats, not the
But you don't
fraction.
have a DV at the GP level.
I can't have, because I don't have the booth level
Vote
data.
share.
Yes.
Hmm.
So the DV is, ideally, you're right. Ideally, the DV would have to be at
Yeah.
the Gram
So
Panchayat level.
right now, you'll have, let's say, if there's 50 GPs in a constituency, you'll have 50 different IVs, or, I mean, how does that?
Wait,
50 GPs in an assembly constituency.
Do you assign the state level, like if the BJP got 50% in, this, Lucknow Central, then every GP, I mean, they don't have GPs in Lucknow Central, but every GP then gets assigned that value. The BJP's,
essentially, yes.
I see. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so there's an assumption basically then that
That there's a natural
aggregate
correspondence,
level
yes,
is perfectly
yes,
distributed.
yes, which I know is
yeah,
problematic because I don't have this booth level
Yeah.
data. I mean, I would love to have this booth. Yeah, no, is that what you were asking? I think this is what you were asking, right? Yeah, yeah, that's
So you
the,
have, okay, split up the DV into,
So you just
assign DV to, also GP.
so if you're in a assembly constituency, you get assigned, I think, like BJP, it would then be assigned like 33 for each GP in that assembly constituency.
yes,
Okay.
that's right.
So there's an assumption being made that it's perfectly distributed. Your ideal would be to then be able to like look at that at the. Okay. We should also be good on, we should also move on faster. just
Yeah,
with that.
no, but I just wanted to emphasize this because I think I also tried to look at changes in vote share between electoral cycles. And so to do that, I essentially use a difference in differences analysis. Again, you're going to find that this is not, I'm not using data at the booth level, I'm using data at the constituency level. And here with the diff and diff, what happens, I think all reservations are pooled together, right? So they are, to each of those reservations, Gram Panchayats is associated a change in vote share from 2012 to 2017. But all of this is done at the aggregate level, essentially. And so the assumption here is that between 2012 and 2015, there's 2012 and 2017, there is the the Panchayati Raj election, local election, fall of 2015, and that a change at that point might have triggered some kind of dynamic that leads to voter mobilization efforts by some of those Gram Pradhans in favor of a party. That's kind of how I'm thinking about this. But again, the diff and diff is really looking, and the difference in differences, what I'm doing here is that I'm looking at villages, at Gram Panchayats, sorry, not villages, Gram Panchayats that were not, I'm using so I'm restricting the analysis to the part of my data set that was not treated in 2010, right? Because I'm trying to see whether a change in the reservation status has an effect on the vote share in 2017, right? So I'm considering, I use an untreated, how much time do I have? Like not 5 minutes?
Yeah,
Already over.
quite over. Yeah, maybe about 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yes.
So I'm leveraging the sort of assignment of a quota as a way to see whether the quotas lead to changes in vote share in 2017, right? So I'm restricting the analysis again to non-treated villages in 2010. I don't do this the same way for all parties because my empirical predictions say that the BJP should be benefiting from theoretically non-reserve villages. So I code the data differently for the BJP, and I'm interested in the untreated status for the BJP. The analysis of the BJP is basically when their village was reserved in 2010 and moved to the non-reserved pool. That's what I did. I also ran that test. I ran that test as well with the same data, which is to say non-reserved to reserved for the BJP as well. That's what I did. Does that make sense?
Let's see the.
Results.
Yeah.
So the change, so
Yeah.
so I'm looking, so by the way, I don't disaggregate this by gender. And so you see that there's like in the case of the BJP, so moving from, this is for the multivariate analysis again, right? The first step, a change, it's not, I mean, it's kind of mixed. There's a bit of a positive change for GPs reserved for the scheduled caste, men and women, and not really a change for OBCs. In the case of, so I did this yet, the reserved to non-reserved, right? There's a little bit of a positive effect. But when you turn to the SP and the BSP, you see more of a change that is consistent with what we would expect, right? So there's more of a positive change in the case of GPs that move to OBC status, right? And a negative change for GPs that move to the SC status in that were essentially assigned the SC status in 2015. For the BSP, it's the opposite. I don't think I've included the Congress. The data on the Congress was not very.
It's also very small in UP.
Yeah, so it wasn't, I didn't include it here because I don't think it was very relevant. And here, this is the result of the diff and diff. This is for the BJP, and for the BJP, what I did is that like I said, I took into account the fact that the BJP might be drawing more support from non-reserved villages than reserved villages. And so the first coefficient, so moving from non-reserved to reserved, there's a positive effect. But moving from reserved to non-reserved gives us a negative effect, which is not quite what we would expect. And again, this is a very sort of imperfect way of, there's so many things that obviously would affect the vote share of a party at the constituency level in 2017, other than the change in the reservation status. So you want to take this with a grain of salt. In the case of the SP, I don't have the data on the INC, but the SP and BSP, there is a negative effect in the case of the SP, which to me, again, take this with a grain of salt, could be also because there was a very strong anti-incumbency feeling in 2017, which affected obviously disproportionately the Samajwadi Party. And there is here a positive effect in the case of the BSP. But none of those results are statistically significant at conventional levels. Maybe I should probably stop here, and because that's really what I have. Again, I want to really emphasize that this is the first step of a much broader project, and one that actually I think I want to take in the direction that says that caste might not be a very, very good predictor at the Gram Panchayat level. But I think I will have to get back to the sort of data and how the data is really broken down at the local level.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thank you.
and sorry for taking so long.
Do we have Gilles about maybe 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, 15?
10.
Yeah, I was looking at me. And so thank you and for the opportunity of discussing Thibaud's paper. So I started reading it and taking notes, and I ended up writing a paper about the paper. But I will cut through the 4,000 words or so that I have, which I will.
You have a history.
Yes.
Okay.
So a couple of observations first. First, it's the topic of the paper is really welcome because there's a dearth of academic interest in local democratic institutions in India as a site of electoral competition, right? The study of Panchayat level politics tends to be overshadowed by a focus on the outcomes of representation, effectiveness of quotas on developments, on public finance, on property rights. Those who have focused on the politics aspects tend to focus on elite capture, proxy representation, gender constraints, or more recently work on inclusion and promotion of women in party organization. But again, they tend not to look at villages as a site of partisan politics, right? The literature on quotas also tends to ignore the competitive dimension of local elections. Since the outcome is mandated by some sort of quota, then there seems to be an assumption that somehow the competitive process and the selection process is somewhat less relevant or important. What's also missing in the literature is work on the connections between local politics and higher level politics, which is what you really are doing. Most scholars are focused on practices of mobilization from identity politics, welfare, clientelism, vote buying, but without always, really demonstrating how effective all these mobilization practices are, right? And so these omissions can be explained as a byproduct of, who are the people who decide to work on panchayats. So there seem to be more development economists and political scientists working on panchayats, for instance. But also by the absence of good public data on panchayat elections. So we know the state of that data. The State Election Commission produces it. They may choose to make it available or not. It's usually very inconsistent. The data will contain only the name of the winner, but not the contestants. There's hardly any data on participation, which we assume is very high. Encoding that data it's a pain. It's highly fuzzy, inconsistent. And so I really want to start by saying that the first merit of the paper is that it's based on evidence that has not just been collected in some public, office, but converted through painstaking effort into a usable data set. And it's great to read a paper that's not based on ready-made data and whose condition of data production remain unclear or unquestioned. So I have, I'm not going to summarize the paper because you've spent quite a bit of time on that already, and so I'll just jump quickly to
Actually, do summarize it.
yeah.
Because very complex. The complexity was forbidding in some ways. So if it's a summary, if there's a summary possible, yes.
So three-line summary is that, so what you're not looking at is the partisan character of local elections, but whether a change in the reservation status of panchayats affects local electoral behavior in higher level elections. And then you formulate a number of hypotheses of what sort of mechanisms and the role of different sort of institutional actors can actually play in explaining those variations. So it's partly an institutional explanation, but it's also an explanation centered around the role of a variety of political actors. And the key finding is that there is an effect, or there seems to be an effect, when the reservation status of a panchayat changes, and therefore quotas, which, so the developmental effect of quotas has been studied in the past, but the political effects have not, and this is really what you're trying to look at. It's a great question.
But caste is not a perfect predictor.
No, and I'll say more on this in a second. So I have a number of remarks and questions. First on your hypothesis and the assumptions that sustain them, then on the data and measurement, and possibly on the findings themselves. So first, you say that the status of panchayat can be used as an imperfect proxy for partisan identity, and that you expect panchayats with a general category Pradhan to lean toward BJP, OBC Pradhan leaning towards SP or SC Pradhan, or Pradhan or panchayat status, right? They're used interchangeably. So I have a bit of difficulties with that, precisely because you don't have data on the caste composition of villages, and you don't have village level electoral behavior data. Right. And so we've discussed how, the rotation is organized, how it's sort of informal in the case of UP. It leaves a lot of space for negotiation on the ground between actors to sort of interfere with a politically neutral system of assignment of reservation status. But fundamentally, it's hard for me to imagine how an SC Pradhan in a village that's otherwise dominated by general castes, possibly upper caste or some dominant caste, may sway non-SC voters in their village to support the BSP by virtue of being Pradhan or by virtue of the village being reserved, right? Similarly, the fact that a village has an OBC reservation status does not necessarily mean that OBCs locally are, dominant and therefore determine local electoral outcome. Also, my experience traveling from one village after another between various cities of UP is that the configuration of every village completely changes, right? And usually the more homogeneous a village is, the more the dominant group tends to be divided into factions and families. So that actually complicates everything. But what I remember from my own fieldwork conducted in UP between 2007 and 2012 is that when a constituency or a panchayat is reserved, Dalit voters in that village can feel encouraged or emboldened to vote for the BSP. Not so much because of the status of the panchayat or because the Pradhan tell them to vote so, but because there's somewhat a lesser fear of retribution. If they choose to vote for the BSP. And so what you have is greater cohesiveness of SC votes when the seat is reserved. It's easier for SC to sort of vote together and to let it known also when the seat is reserved, rather than higher cross-group support for the BSP. And that may account for the differences between what you see in the data for the SP and the BSP and for the BJP, right? Second, the paper touches upon an important question, which is how parties mobilize. We know that candidates seek to mobilize the support of local elites, who in turn mobilize the segment of voters that they may have influence on. That has been the modus operandi of Indian politics ever since independence and probably before. Right? The definition of who is an elite will vary through time, but the idea that local elites play a role of mediation between voters and parties is central to the literature and applies actually for every period, although in different configurations. And so these local elites may or may not be in charge of local institutions, notably but not exclusively according to the village reservation status. Right? So should a village be reserved for SC? Is it more likely that a party like the BJP will seek to mobilize voters there through an SC Pradhan, who may or may not be proxy, or through members of whichever groups are locally dominant? I would think it's probably more the latter than the former. And so what I'm pointing at is that local politics tends to be shaped by a village local elites who often choose whichever candidate gets to become Pradhan, including when the seat is reserved. And these elites are not just caste elite. They're, I think before all, they are economic elites, right? And in my experience, they tend to do whatever they like, rather than be beholden to specific parties over time. Right? And so regardless of the fact that the status of the panchayat may change, the status of the elites sort of will remain, the same. So you have different categories of actors, and I don't have the time to go into the detail, but you have elected officials, local elites, brokers, pradhans, but according to each village, they may or they may not be the same people. I mean, not the email, obviously, and so I wonder how much trouble we get ourselves into when we sort of keep conceptualizing systematically as separate actors. Third, since you're studying relations between Pradhans and parties, where do these meetings take place, right? MLAs can only visit a fraction of villages of their constituencies. At the time of elections, Pradhans can be rounded up by candidates and parties for mobilization, but once they go back in their village, they can do whatever they like. Right? There's a lot of evidence that Pradhans get associated to campaigns. When we ran our survey in Haryana of Pradhans in 2020 in Haryana, we had to stop because the proximity with the campaign meant that the Pradhans were never in the villages because they were always somewhere else, campaigning. Not even in their villages, but campaigning on behalf of parties, but somewhere else. Right? But otherwise, interactions between Pradhans and MLAs tend to be rare. Candidates usually don't know whether they're going to be nominated before a few weeks ahead of the election. So that sort of prevent the building of, those ties and networks that we keep writing about. And fundamentally, the relations with bureaucrats is far more important to Pradhans than the local MLA, right? In the everyday life of a panchayat. On data and measurement, So obviously there are going to be huge challenges in doing quantitative work because of the paucity of the data. But since you don't have the data that you would ideally need to build to support your model, electoral behavior at the village level, caste composition of villages, Jati of Pradhan, so you use proxies. You're looking for a proxy, which is the reservation status of a village. But then doesn't it become tricky to transpose to these proxies the assumption that you would make if you had the right kind of data in the first place?
Mhm.
Right? And there I had a remark which is very similar to the question that you asked. If you assume that panchayats are well distributed across constituencies, it's not obvious to me that you can attribute vote share variations to panchayat status change, right? Because some reservation status will go from one direction to another, but the overall share of reserved seats will remain the same within each constituency, right? So I don't see how you can isolate the effect of reservation status change with constituency level vote share data. Second, I'm wondering to what extent your findings are affected by the overall performance of parties. I mean, 2012, 2017, there were swing elections. So huge variations in how people voted. And also a context of transformation in UP where most major parties, SP and BJP, first of all, greatly diversified their vote bases, right? And so to keep working with the assumption that, certain groups will go for certain parties. And I mean, at the local level, there's such heterogeneity that I find it a bit problematic. Third, another potential problem, we now have evidence, and that's something that we discussed a couple of weeks ago at Brown with Pradeep Chiber and Francesca Jensenius. We have evidence that electoral behavior at the local level is highly volatile. Right? They have coded polling booth data for 2 general elections, 2014, 2019. They find that
National elections.
They find that 26% of voters in rural India changed their vote between 2 elections, and that this effect is actually higher among the poor, right? Their measure is the polling booth. It does not exactly match villages, but I would imagine that that volatility would remain if you succeeded in doing that matching exercise, right? One of the explanations is perennial dissatisfactions with parties and candidates, a lack of stable partisanship for many voters due to poor engagements of elites and parties and the poor. My main issue perhaps is that your assumptions and analysis seems to be tied to a literature on party voter linkages and class politics that's quite frankly dated, right? The way we used to write, and I put myself in that category, the way we used to write about caste and clientelism, it seems tricky for me to use that as a base assumption and then, build up, a base strategy. The fact that, most MLAs don't get reelected, there's a huge turnover of the political class, which is what I've been writing about, the volatility that you have on the ground. It sort of muddles the ground to a large extent. So since the paper is in exploratory phase, what I would invite you to consider is just state first that we don't know much about the connections between local politics in institutions and electoral behavior at higher level. And that one way to look at the effect of reservation of panchayat is to sort of see whether we observe an effect or not on electoral behavior. And the way the research has been designed right now seems to indicate that there is an effect. But use that as a strategy to ask questions.
Rather than what I want to do.
Yes, rather than use that as a way to answer questions that are based on
literature.
Well, weak premises. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound harsh.
No, that really is what I was trying to do.
So the polling booth data will soon be available. It's going to be national election, so nothing is ever perfect in this world. But what would be interesting, and I'm ending on this, is to test this idea that the reservation status of a village may affect the cohesiveness of local disadvantaged groups when there's a congruence of status and identity, status of panchayat and identity of that particular group. And that possibly could account for why the effect seems to be more visible for OBC and NSCs, but not for BJP voters.
Say that again, the last sentence. I'm sorry, I was just.
So what would be interesting is test this idea that the reservation status of a village will affect the cohesiveness of
Okay.
voters within a group, right?
Yes, okay.
Which may account for why you see more effect among disadvantaged group than elite
Yeah,
voter.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's what.
But using the national data though.
Well, yes, I mean,
Right,
it's going to
which
create
is-
its own limitation,
yeah,
but I think having polling booth data will solve
that big.
many of your problems.
Could you repeat this last sentence one more time?
That's a good point, actually.
If they change in the reservation
Yes,
status
of a village
of a village,
may
change
the
may
co-
shape the
the
cohesiveness
cohesiveness.
of the disadvantaged group, the group
Yes.
for which it was reserved.
That's right. The mechanism is that local delegates will feel, more confidence to vote for the SPE if they feel that they have the backing of local officials from their own communities, right?
But it's still not saying anything about the assembly constituency though. The
No,
last point is not about that.
no, but it's not about explaining electoral outcomes. It's to explain the effect that changing the status of a panchayat may have
On the
vote.
cohesiveness, so your DV in this statement is cohesiveness of
Yeah.
the
That
disadvantaged
actually would
group.
be really interesting to
Rather
know.
than reasoning in
Yeah,
terms
yeah.
of caste party alignment.
Yeah.
I mean, that's your work too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, it's the cohesiveness of the Muslim vote that determines whether they can increase. I mean, actually, I have written about that too when I think of it. Whether that can increase their representation by avoiding split voting and so forth.
Couple of thoughts about, I mean, one is, I think initially you pointed out proxy candidates, right? So
Yeah.
that kind of challenges.
Yeah,
this. So if the candidate is a proxy, then, the broker so-called is still the elite.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Caste elite. So, I mean, in that case, cohesiveness should not shift. Second is, this is also dynamic kind of setting, right? So if this is a reserved SC, constituency, there's a very, very high chance this will not be a reserved SC constituency in
Yes.
the next cycle.
Yep.
So the non-SC elite still has an incentive to,
Wait.
support the party because, or support let's say the BJP because to, get in favor with them before the next cycle. So, I mean, this is not a static model where reserved stays reserved.
Let's open up more broadly. So I can take a list of folks. We can start with Gautam, Shay, follow me. Okay. Let's also collect questions, I think, and then maybe we can collect three, do some answers, collect three, do some answers. Shay.
Great. Thank you, Thibaud. I have sort of more of a clarifying question on the theory and then a suggestion on the empirics. So on the theory, I was wondering also about proxy candidates, and I was wondering if, partisan sway or partisan lean is really going to change if all that is happening when the reservation status changes, is that there's a proxy candidate instead, but the elite really stay the same.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't sure how to square that with your hypotheses, but I was also wondering one other idea that you mentioned, or one other nuance that you mentioned early on, was that, there is, as a result of local level elections, greater competition and perhaps the emergence of a new set of leaders. And if that is indeed happening, then we might see greater mobilization along caste lines with the emergence of this new set of leaders. So one thing you could do to test that is, let's say, if an assembly constituency has more villages that are reserved for SCs and have a plurality of SCs, then we should see a larger DSP vote share at the constituency level, or something
So
along those lines.
larger number of, yes. A
Larger number of SCs that happen to fall under reserved
Yes.
reserved
Okay.
Gram Panchayat.
And that's measurable.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think just as a starting point
Yeah,
would
yeah.
be an interesting piece of analysis that might speak to one of the ideas that you have.
Yep, no, that's a good point.
Gautam, then follow me.
I think it's a really interesting project, Thibaud, in the sense of what is the actual influence of the institution on partisanship is not something I think that has been studied. I think, and that's a great direction to go in. I was wondering, like, okay, so you know your empirical analysis right now.
Yeah.
Thibaud and I are like good friends, so I'm just gonna be frank about it.
No, go ahead.
I mean, you cannot just take the constituency level
Yeah.
vote share and assign them. You'll not be able to measure any effects because basically you're just
It's
getting, it's
pooled.
just measurement error.
Yeah.
That's all you're getting, you know.
Yeah.
So just because you're literally assigning
Yeah.
all of the variation away, right? Because it's all at the constituency level, just giving it to the villages. So you
Yeah.
have to measure that, and I think
At the village level, at the booth
yeah,
level.
the precinct level stuff that
Mm.
Jean is talking about will help you to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Right? So that was one thought I had. The other thought I had was like, okay, even in like Tariq and Adam's book, you know, when I look at the analysis, it actually shows that caste matters a lot. People like people of their own caste. It's just that education also matters. And in a way, like, why wouldn't it? And I think if you said, well, you know, if you are still a patronage democracy, let me show you how that is, right? And the reason is, well, if a given Gram Panchayat is reserved for a specific caste group, that gives you certain types of access to certain scarce goods. And the fact that that might translate into vote share of parties, right? So holding fixed, you know, an SC reservation in a Gram Panchayat, or having a SC reserved Gram Panchayat translates into less vote share for the BJP, right? Means that basically party, like, you know, upper level parties don't matter as much as we think they do. And you know, these having influence through these institutions still matters. So it's not like parties can just change their platform, converse the median voter in a given Gram Panchayat, and everything's forgotten. And that's why distributive outcomes will change. But I don't think you've shown that yet. And so your strength might be to like go and talk to people.
No, but the thing, can I respond or should I wait for?
Rather than do a statistical analysis.
Just only do this,
Yeah, no,
you know, because people have done some of the stuff with NRGS as you have already. So, but you know, it could just be a piece. That was my thought, you know. Yeah.
Let's take Polami then.
Polami and
response
then,
then Ashu.
So yeah, I mean, I would second Gautam's enthusiasm about it's new stuff. I don't think I've read anything on it. And I have a couple of suggestions. So, Jean's mechanism that he suggested for voter cohesion. The other mechanism that might be working is emergence of local unions, right? So if these GP candidates want to move up in the party hierarchy, say like join the DSP or join the BJP at some point, it makes sense for them to mobilize, right? So even if, say, in a OBC category where voter intimidation might not be the main concern, and if you're seeing these effects, then it might be something else that's going on. And the fact that you don't see that for BJP, which is quite a strongly organized party, and you see that for like the OBC and SC constituencies where party organization is quite weak, that might be the other reason. But I would agree that like even if you get booth level data, the statistical analysis
won't be very revealing.
Your strength is to like, you know, interview people, find out this must be going on. I won't be surprised if that is.
Yeah, or survey.
Sorry, yeah, no, I want to say, I mean, this is the interesting, can I respond very quickly? And then Ashu, you can ask your question. So this is just, I mean, you saw from the beginning of the presentation that I actually don't really believe that's the case. But I've been trying to think about how to make the most of the data I have. So this is the reason why I said this is my first stab at it. But I mean, I'm convinced, and this is really what I would love to do, what you said, like writing I mean, I would love to write a book on how institutions really like work probably against parties, in the sense that they really, if you think of the reservations, this is what I've observed when I was there, and I think you would probably agree with me. The reservations really create a world of shifting sands. Like for parties, it's actually very difficult to know where their voters are, to know, let alone to build an operation on the ground that will be reliable, that is worth investing in a way. So I'm well aware of that. So I know this is like you know, that there is, and so I really like the idea of like looking at this other hypothesis, because I think this is more probably better, more productive use of my time. But because the reason why I wanted to sort of like start with this is because I had the data. So I wanted to see where that went. But I'm well aware that this is, the final answer is probably not that. Yeah, Ashu?
So yes, I have also not read anything on the impact of using some generic categories, impact of local level politics on higher levels. So certainly this is but I have I think we'll learn a lot as the project proceeds further. But given the kind of field work that some of us were doing, well, let me just concentrate myself. 2014 and 2014, 19, and now 2024, and almost all of it in UP, not all of it, but you know, Andhra Pradesh also, Haryana also, Delhi as well. But again and again and again, the narratives that were emerging in UP, villages and small towns, was that the category of OBC and the category of SC also needs to be disaggregated. So these are the data that all of us have worked with. This is what it looked like. OBC. So we used to say that UP is 2020, 2040. This is how we began. In any war room, if you're sitting in a political party, you're sitting there and you're talking to people, and on that basis, I created this category called UP's 2020, 2040. So I said, what is it? So the NDTV would ask, or CNN would ask, what is 2020, 2040? 20% upper caste, 20% SC, 20% Muslim, and 40% OBC. Right? Now, and obviously then next step, that's the first step in the war room of understanding UP's caste or UP's social category universe. The second is OBCs, yes, they're 41%, and Yadavs are 9, Kurmis are 4. Repeatedly I heard this. Lodhis are 2, depending on where I was. Or Yadav sir यहाँ पे 12 बैठेंगे, 13 बैठेंगे, something like that. लेकिन कुर्मी 8 बैठेंगे, you know. और वो हम दोनों, I'll translate it for those who don't know Hindi. वो सर वो हम लोग साथ साथ नहीं हैं. Or some lower OBCs, for example, Kevat, हम उनके साथ नहीं है सर Yadav, right? Similarly, the most surprising part of this segregation was that Mayawati's big base, basically, that was known actually. It was Jatav, right? But the non-Jatav Dalits happened to be in UP about 8% and Jatavs about 12%. That's 20%. Then not so Jatav, she's getting about 80%. Was getting, not this time, not in this election. 75 to 80% of Jatav vote she was, but over time, but not non-Jatav vote.
Yeah.
And now the Jatav vote is also split. Now, so once you have this kind of disaggregation of SC and the OBC, in upper caste we can do also, because the Thakur versus Brahmin is quite large. Thakur Brahmins are roughly 11, 12. Brahmins are 11 to 12% of UP, which is probably the largest proportionate share of Brahmins in any state of India, with the possible exception of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. Otherwise, no state of India has 12%. 12% of state is Brahmin. This is not true. I think I will be surprised if I'm wrong about this, except Uttarakhand, right? And Thakurs would again and again say we are 7% to 8% of UP, or that turns out to about 6% of UP. And we are not, and Baniyas are about 2%, Kayas are about 2%. We are not necessarily the same supporters of Brahmins, right? So once this, if this is so, it was so repeatedly told, then the idea that if an OBC, how does it complicate your analysis that an OBC reserved constituency changes to something else, SC reserved constituency changes to something else, and therefore there should be some impact of that. Because the SC reserved constituency, depending on where you are, in East UP, Jatavs would be a smaller category and Parsis would be larger. Right? In West UP, this would not be true. So this kind of disaggregation, I don't know what it means. I'm asking you, this kind of disaggregation of caste data, and in Muslim case, he's dealing with disaggregation of Muslim votes, etc. But this caste data, which I hadn't thought about until I read him. So this is, does it affect you at all, or it can be? This is a minor detail. It has very little analytic relevance, etc.
You mean the state level?
The fact that the state level I gave you, how it distributes over at the local level. How many Parsis are there? How opposed they are to Jatavs? How many? Right? In the SC category, and let's take the bigger ones in the OBC category. How many Gurmis and Lodhs are there, as opposed to Yadavs, and what is the relationship in these two?
Yeah, can I say two finger on this?
Yeah.
So I was thinking a little bit about this because I'm not sure how much the reservation status is proxying for like some institutional thing versus like also at the same time demographics, right? And so and this speaks a little bit to Ash's point, because if you have an OBC reserved constituency, it could be OBC reserved signaling it's Yadav dominated. It could be OBC reserved signaling it's someone else's, right?
Could be
Which is the right.
You need somebody. It could be done. Yeah.
But then you
And
usually have someone that is determining who gets elected, right?
Right.
In a Western UP, in a village where among Dalits, the Jatav dominates, the local, Thakur or Jat will pick, a Valmiki
right.
to be part of.
And so I think in the analysis, you may have to say like, this is an OBC reserved constituency, but given it is in this region, it probably is Yadav, which means we should find the SP effect here.
Which will be Central UP for sure.
Right.
Central UP will be the OBC dominated areas will be Yadav dominated. On the whole in Central UP.
Because I think you're
so reservation is context dependent in that sense.
Right, because you're also, to pick up an effect, if you have the local level data, you're going to cancel out the effect if you're thinking that non-Yadav OBC area is actually going to move towards the SP. In fact, it probably shouldn't. It should probably move towards the BJP because BJP is making outreach to those groups at this time period.
And BJP is also trying to attract the non-Jatav SC.
Same thing in the SC, right.
The same idea that we should, if you talk to them, we will get lower OBCs, we'll get lower SCs. That's they talk about upper SCs and lower SCs, upper OBCs, lower OBCs.
This also is why they win so highly in the 2017, which is one of the right. I mean, you've written on this as well.
The outreach to smaller groups.
So I don't know what it means, but I think perhaps this is the way, in the direction in which we can go.
It's very difficult to test. I mean, I'm absolutely obsessed with this now, but it's just really.
So I had just two small comments. One was so I actually think one value before I think in some ways you're like, I have some time to do some data work before I start to think about what I want to touch in the field. And so one thought I had was like, why not? And okay, I do think this will be challenging, but I think that Raphael Suswind has polling station level data. It's not geolocated, but if there's some way to like take the location,
was it Kings, right?
He
was my colleague,
in Kings also has
and in UP during this time, and
actually, I could reach out.
I wonder if even if you just get it for like, I don't know, 5 constituencies, it could be helpful to see if generally a pattern is holding where these places are moving. That at least tells you like what you might want to focus on, because I think it would be more convincing if you told me that you found this in like 5 assembly constituencies where you have the local data. The other thing I was going to say is it's not clear how the higher level reservation status plays a role in this, right? Because there are higher level reservations, at least for the SC.
I left out. No, you're right. That's also completely left out at the end
for only SCs. But you may want to start, if you start with a couple ACs, you may just want to start with general ACs and just start there to say like I'm not paying attention to the reservation status at the higher level. The last point is more of a theoretical point, which is I really like this idea of like parties kind of using the local level as a way to kind of build their brand and like mobilize votes, especially in rural areas. I think it's interesting. I do think you may have to take a view on whether elections are actually end up being more partisan or not at the local level by the end of the project, I think you will. And there is some helpful, like, some people have run some surveys to see how much people know the party of each candidate, and it actually varies quite a lot by state. UP is actually on the lower end. And I have done some field work on this, at least with Muslim candidates at the local level. And I also find that people don't really tend to know exactly who they're affiliated with. But I think the other story, which you've moved on from, which I actually think is the strength of the project, but you'll have to address it in an alternative explanation, is that it's somewhat of a bottom-up story, which is that voters in an OBC reserved constituency or panchayat, right, is saying like, I have some OBC person as my panchayat representative, my sarpanch, and I think that the co-production of goods between the MLA and that person
Might
is
work in my
likely
favor.
better. So that's why I swing towards SB. It's not about the party politics. This would be my preferred explanation, partially because I show this with Muslim politics at the local level and at the higher level. Like you're making some assumption about shared identity and what that means for the co-production of goods. And so you'll have to show that, like, maybe it's a combo of both, right? Maybe because parties know this will happen at the voter level, parties engage in more party building there, but I think there has to be some incorporation of voters making independent decisions about the panchayat in relation to the kind of pyramid structure.
On a side note, I'm actually coding Gram Panchayats as to whether or not they have a Muslim.
Okay, we should talk because I have some of this.
So you have some of this, right? Because
Yeah.
I thought, because that's easier to code
It's easier to code
than
on
everything else.
Yeah. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. We can take like.
Can I put one more thing on the agenda?
Sure.
But not if other people have to say something.
Okay.
So the urban project that we've run in 14 cities of India, Patrick and I and Siddharth Swaminathan, so the now results are ready. I just want to know what would be its what would be its form in rural politics. So our cities are chosen from all parts of India, various sizes, 7 of the 8 biggest, 3 in the middle level and 3 in the lower level, etc. That there is a new political figure in urban politics who's acquired remarkable importance. We have a very large data set, is very large, samples are very large, and they show that the councillor, the urban councillor, the municipal councillor, called all kinds of things in different places, but basically the municipal councillor or corporate councillor is the most important person for getting public goods. He mediates between you and the bureaucracy, which has to provide water and some sanitation problem and some electricity
That's
problem.
at the ward level?
Huh?
That's at the ward level.
Yeah.
Yes, generally speaking, that's true. Yes, but so now, is your elected guy at the local, at the village level, since he was talking about co-production here, is he seen as this person through which, not the MLA? For us, it is MLA, we've asked, MLA, MP, councillor. Councillor is the most important. This is a new development in Indian politics. We never knew, right? This is obviously a result of the 74th, right? So has 73rd led to something similar at the urban, at the rural level?
Village level,
There's some tables in Jennifer Basel's book that gets at like whether you ask the MLA or the
Gram Pradhans. Yeah, she does have
MLA in this also is number 2 in our this thing. And MP is far away from this stuff. Our MP is not relevant to these calculations.
That's why I left.
Water, sanitation, electricity, roads also, neighborhood roads. Okay, so just a thought for is the elected village Gram Pradhan? My sense is he would be, but because the goodies available at the village level actually are greater. That's one of the paradoxes of and it's because it's still a primarily rural democracy. So, for example, if you see the budget of rural development and compare it to even at the Delhi level, forget the state level. Rural development ministries by Jairam Ramesh's was 3 times as high or 2.8 times as high as that of urban development. There are more goodies available for the rural level.
That still means more money for cities and villages. Right?
Sorry? That means
With
what?
that ratio, it still means more money for cities than.
Per capita terms, you can say, well, no, it's about 68-32 according to the consensus, right? 3 times would be a bit more available for the city, for the countryside.
Isn't it 50-50 now?
According to Partho Mukhopadhyay, his analysis of what is urban, that depends on the definition then.
Yeah.
If you use his definition, then India is probably 55-45 now. And China is 40-60. China is 40-60. 55 rural and 45,
Okay.
heading quickly towards 50,
Yeah.
but not according to the census.
I see.
Official census will probably put it at 62-38,
I see.
62 rural, 38, right?
Mm.
From 68-32 to 62-38.
Yeah.
No, I think someone has seen the data.
Well, in the interest of time, I just want to thank you to both for the presentation. Thank you, Gilles, for
Thank
the
you,
comments,
for
and
the
thanks
comments.
everyone for attending. Thank you.
And there you go.